Yep.
All right, so I'm joined here by the lovely MarkZ. I'm here, and we're going to be discussing a little bit of, I guess, the LCS. So I think first and foremost, you were someone with a pretty extensive background in being on broadcast. So what made you want to transition into the whole, I guess, commissioner role?
There's a couple things. One, on just a personal level, I like learning and doing more. So anytime I do anything for too long, I'm get antsy and just want to start doing something else. So I have been doing broadcasts for 7 years or so. And over the last couple of years, there were a number of changes around the LCS where I began to think bigger picture. And when Jackie Felling, the previous LCS commissioner, came in, she and I talked a lot. And it was something that began to build my interest in the position. And so I threw my hat in the ring after that and just kind of pursued it pretty aggressively to, make it clear that I'm not just thinking of this as a random talent with here's some ideas. I've had decks and pitches and all these sorts of things. So it was mostly wanting to start trying to steer the LCS in a bigger way than just content, which is basically all I've done before.
And I feel like one of the big, I guess, positive outcomes has been that you are pretty vocal about the changes as well as feedback. I know you did a couple of Twitch streams on the LCS channel, so I think a lot of fans can appreciate the upfrontness and the transparency. So I want to talk to you about, I guess, the short-term plans for the LCS. So obviously, a couple of changes coming to America or NA in general next year. Obviously, some of those are probably still in the works. So as much as you can share, what are some the short-term plans?
So I don't think there's really what I would call short-term plans. The whole point of this is to be pretty long-term positioning. There's obviously two parts to it. There's the more global component, which is the changes in the financial model to the GRP from the LRP and all that sort of stuff, which we can get into if you want. And then there's the more regional Americas level, which is how we're actually structuring the leagues and the conferences and all those sorts of things. But the goal is to be, this is what we intend to be like for the foreseeable future. We're always fluid. We're always listening and adapting. And so I'm sure there'll be things that we're going to tweak over time. But the ideas that we've kind of laid out so far publicly that we can speak to, that is what we think should work pretty well for the foreseeable future, unless esports changes again, which tends to happen. There's not many 5-year plans in esports that make it to year 5.
Yeah, that is true. And I guess a lot of the changes in a way seem relatively parallel to Valorant. Would you say that the LCS is trying to borrow some of these successes from the Valorant regional programs, such as APAC and the Americas?
Yeah, for sure. I think both esports learn from each other where they can. They initially had a very similar league-based setup from what we did, but instead of having the franchise fees and that sort of buy-in, they did a more partner model and they had incentive structures and different things. And so both esports are constantly talking to each other. Their office is our office. We're all right there, so it's very easy to pass ideas back and forth. I talk to the Valorant league guys a couple times a month at least. So it's pretty common to trade ideas back and forth, see what works for them, and acknowledge also that the products are different, the games are different, the fandoms are different, and the scenes are different. So, they, for the Valorant side, have a single league based in LA for all of their teams to come up and play in. We're going to have 2 conferences. A big portion of that was because CBLOL has an entire history, whereas there was not a league that was running for 10 years, in the Valorant side. So for us, it was a big part of, for the fans that had been around for so long, making sure that they had things that they really cared about.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of the regional developments, you get a lot of more fandom. I recently interviewed Pro Bellator roughly about a month ago, and I believe the question is the aim to recapture some of the old magic of League came up. So would you say you're it's probably not something you guys have written down on the whiteboard, but would you say the goal is to kind of recapture some of the Magic League you used to have, or are you trying to build your own Magic in the future?
Well, it's not on the whiteboard. It's in the deck under confidential thing that only me and Carlos Atunes see.
Can I see it?
No. It's a couple other people have seen it, but no, that is we talk about goals, high level goals. What's the point of all this stuff? We have our pillars, which are things that drive our decision making, which is different than the goal, which is where you want to land. So for us, a big thing is innovation. You've seen it with the Twitch extension, subs. The transparency kind of folds into that, where we're trying to approach how we talk with our fans differently. Our formats are always going to be pretty innovative. We're willing to experiment with the formats. And so innovation is a pillar, but what is it driving to? And that's the goal. And so one of those goals is reaching churned and lapsed fans, especially for the North American side. Brazilian side, it's a totally different story because they're, everyone has their ups and downs, but they're hitting, pretty crazy numbers this year. Whereas for us, we had been on a kind of multi-year slide in the North American scene. And so a big portion of this year's plans and next year's as well is carry your history as best as you can into the future, but also understand that there's a lot of people who need to get reignited, reinterested in the leagues and these sorts of things. And LATAM is a similar situation where we know that there's big player base, and we want to capture a bigger portion of that with the esports side.
Yeah, and you mentioned innovation. I think one of the biggest ones, at least very recently, was the Twitch subs. So I'm sure you're not able to share the exact numbers, but I mean, if you are, that'd be great. But if not, would you say the Twitch sub experiment has been under expectations, at expectations, or exceeded them? Would you say?
So on specific numbers, we're checking to see if we're going to share those or not. I think we want to, but there's always legal concerns, so we need to check all the boxes, make sure we can. But there's a chance in when this program is concluded at the end of this week, basically, because we're only doing it for that 1 month trial. Yeah, we'll have some post about that, and it might include numbers or not. But big picture, I think we're happy with where it's at. I'm an optimist. Anytime anyone asks me to project something, I'm like, 50 million. I'm like, okay, that's probably not the right number.
Yeah, me too.
So I'm a positive person. Other people are doomers. And I think we've landed somewhere pretty comfortably in the middle. I think we're very happy with it, and I think it's a great proof of concept. Not just on the raw numbers, but also learning what fans are using, how many subs we have versus people who join the Discord versus are watching or using the features, because we threw a bunch of other things other than just a sub out there. So we're collecting a lot of data and gonna bring that to the rest of Riot to be like, hey, here's what this program did for us. What do we want to do in the future?
Yeah, that sounds pretty good. I think one of the biggest struggles esports faces, specifically I feel like League, since it is a free-to-play game, everything is free 99, it's kind of hard to generate revenue.
Yeah.
So as much as you can, like, where do you think the focus is more on fan experience versus, I guess, profit margins? Like, where do you think the needle drops, so to speak?
I mean, I'm pretty far on the fan experience side, but I'm also a capitalist.
We're in America.
Yeah,
we are in America.
So I think the best answer is that the experiences you're giving fans, you let them choose with their wallet because you're giving something that they actually really want. And I think esports sometimes has not always been the best at giving them a way to spend. I think we give them tons of value. Like being an esports fan is pretty sick. You get to watch the streams for free. There's all these great events. Most of the ticket prices are pretty affordable as much as we can make them. These sorts of things. We're not gouging people across the board on a lot of that stuff. And so I think something like Twitch subs is an example where I think there are lots of people who are happy to add $5 to get the features that we've kind of put out there. And that's a good relationship for both sides, where it can be a new revenue stream for us and give fans something that they've wanted this whole time. Because when the announcement came out, there was a lot of snark in that Reddit thread, but if you really cut to the core of it, it was basically like, you should have had this the whole time. And that says, hey, there actually is an interest in the market for this.
Yeah. And I mean, embarrassingly, I've watched more LCK and LPL than women I've talked to. So I guess I was watching the LPL playoffs recently, and they do player walkouts. Even LCK does it. So I guess for fan experience, I'm a little bit like a long-term fan. Is there a reason why we don't imitate some of their practices, such as like walkouts? Because I feel like just a lot of fans, for example, when they just arrive in the studio, the players are pretty much either doing tech check or they're on stage ready to go. So I feel like, is there a reason why we aren't doing certain practices I feel like that are common in other regions, or is it just like we haven't thought about it yet?
No, it's mostly product goals. So for example, like they did best of threes, right? And they have set times. It's like, I don't know the exact times. It's like 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. or something. And if a series ends early, they just go, okay. And that's their product choice. That's how they want to run their league. For us, we care about fan experience, about being fast. We want you to watch all the games. We want you to have this opportunity. So we slam as soon as we can, which stage transitions and all these sorts of things. And so, that does sometimes come at a cost of presentation value. You want to get the next game started. That's what most people are watching for. And so if we were going to do walkouts and introductions and give the microphone to players to talk shit for 2 minutes before the game started, all that adds time. And one of the product calls we made this year was like, let's be really fast. Like, it's a constant source of feedback from at least the North American audience, which is another thing to acknowledge, is that I'm not saying what Korea is doing is wrong, because their audience is obviously very happy.
It's really cool, yeah.
Their audience loves what they're doing, but one thing we always saw was start the next game. And we challenge ourselves to say, like, reassuming all foundations, what can we do to speed the game up? And that's where we came up with pre-recorded drafts and these sorts of things, to be like, if people want to get us into the next game, like, let's actually dig into this with a new viewpoint.
Yeah, and you mentioned how some of the presentation value is unfortunately missed out on when you prioritize, I guess, logistics. So what are some other drawbacks do you think with the current LCS format? Because I think there's a lot of upside. I think overall sentiment has gotten better. We have a lot of co-streamers like Cadril, Tyler One, who are, in a way, I mean, they're obviously supporting it by co-streaming, but like when they expose their audiences to the LCS, it's a lot more eyes on the product. So there's a lot of improvements and a lot of like good things, but what are some other drawbacks would you say of having the emphasis being on turnover time?
Well, I think that's one element, and it's not that where the emphasis is on transition times for the sake of transition times, on fan feedback. And so, we pretty aggressively keep track of everything that fans are talking about. And so if there's ever a big push, we'll pivot. And so I haven't seen people be like, overwhelmingly be like, man, I wish they did player walkouts. And if there was 5 Reddit threads for the next year, all #1 with 10,000 upvotes, I'd be like, shit, all right, let's do that. But for right now, that just doesn't seem like what our audience is craving. Our league is extremely digestible. We find that most of our fans are really attached to the league as a whole versus a specific team. So to go back to like a Korea example, like T1's huge, and their viewership is like 10x what the average is. It seems like, or whatever.
I'm not a T1 fan myself, so
there's either haters or fans, but someone you feel some type of way about T1. And what we see for the North American fan is a lot of them actually do want to make like watching the LCS kind of their day, and they're going to watch the entire league, and they're going to watch all the teams. And so making it a digestible schedule is something that we think is important. So that's one of the reasons we also did that. So it's always going to be a trade-off. Like you said, there's downsides of, we don't have as much goofy stuff maybe between games as we once did when we made it faster. And we tried to supplement that by recording more things in other ways and put them more on YouTube and shoulder content. So you saw pros, you saw these other things. And it's all very intentional. Like when we reduce transition times, we know we're losing things, and we're trying to put them in other places. So if you want to get to know a pro, it might not be during a walkout, but we're going to have a 40-minute sit down where he's going to talk to 3 other pros. So I think the opportunities are still there.
Yeah, and I mean, as we're on the topic of fan experience, I think BO3s is very positively received. And I mean, you're someone who has been in the scene for longer than I've been in diapers. So what do you think are some of the benefits of having BO3 from a competitive standpoint? Because in my opinion, I had this conversation with, I believe, Golden Glue, and he said that the floor is about the same, but you're exposing teams to a higher ceiling. Because now to account for draft adaptations, you can't pull a cheat pick and just win a game and go home. So what do you think are some of the competitive upsides to what LCS has done recently?
I think that is the biggest one, is by having series play as a thing that is consistent throughout the regular season. When the postseason comes, you're already a little bit more used to it. It's just about the scale that increases. So I think there's value there. I think it's worth noting that I always say this is like, it's not like internationals are all series play. There are still best of ones often in Swiss stage and these sorts of things. And so I think the idea of never having best of ones again is something where it's like, well, there are concerns as well. But I think that is one of the big things, is that best of threes give you that mid-series adaptation. And I think it's also a better test for a fan to see who's actually the better team. Upsets are really cool. I love best of ones for that reason, that anything can happen. And there's plenty of times where someone wins game 1 and they get slammed game 2 and game 3, and you're like, all right, that was fake news. So so I think like there are trade-offs in the narratives that you're telling that you can use to inform, depending on where you're at different parts of the year, what's more important. Is it really about testing people, or is it about hype? I think those are 2 different trade-offs as well. When we talk about trade-offs from before, formats can play into that as well too. So I think competitively, it's a better test, and it allows teams to practice adaptation a little bit more.
Yeah, and I guess on the topic of hype versus adaptation and performance, going into the future, I mean, do you feel like, honestly speaking, you said you're an optimist, but being fully transparent, being Mark here and not MarkZ from the LCS, do you feel like NA is getting a lot closer to bridging the gap, would you say? Because I personally feel like we are.
Internationally?
I don't think we're too far off.
I actually do a lot. And I'll tangent for a second here, because I see the conversation a lot about best of threes and stage time being some sort of performance metric, that like people get better because they got more stage time. And that is categorically and empirically not true at all.
Really?
Well, yeah, because every time that a region, here's where people get lost. Korea does this; they have tons of games. Same with LPL, and they're the best 2 regions in the world. And that it does matter. I'm not going to say it's totally irrelevant, but there's a million other factors that are more important for why those regions have been the best historically in League of Legends. And it's not stage time. And in 2016, when we added games and we did dual streams and we did all these things, same with LEC was EU LCS back then.
Yeah,
we didn't perform any better. And now we're playing fewer games this year, and people are like, well, you need games on stage to be good. And meanwhile, Team Liquid's the best representative we've seen in forever, and they're challenging T1. So the correlation is not there. It's purely a feeling thing, which I understand. When you spend more time on stage, you feel more comfortable, but it doesn't actually lead to competitive success. That has everything to do with how you approach every other day of the week. There's 24 hours in the day. What are you doing in those 6 days that you're not on stage, or the 5 days you're not on stage? That will determine what you do on stage way more. And I think, to be blunt with some of our teams, they're not always putting the best in for those other days of the week. And I think Team Liquid does. I think Team Liquid tries so hard, and they've elevated the region with their approach. I think Spawn's a great coach. I think FlyQuest is doing a great job as well. Golden Glue as well for 100 Thieves. They've taken it a lot more seriously, it feels like, this year. And I think that is the reason that it's been elevated. And that's what I would always push, is like, listen, like, that's what's going to determine how well you do. It's like, what is your team doing the rest of the week?
Yeah. And I mean, unfortunately, I'm not a Zillion main, so we're pretty much out of time. Do you have any words?
Sorry, I filibustered you on that one because I feel passionately about that
No,
topic.
of course. I mean, I'd rather see that than like very cut and dry answers. So do you have any words to the fans at home?
No, thank you all for watching the LCS. Appreciate the interview.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.